Hello everyone, Mark Hossler, CEO of Secure Choice Lending, coming to you guys today to talk about inflation, interest rates, and why I believe interest rates are at or near a top within the next 30 days. So let's get into it. What is inflation? Inflation is just an increase in prices over a specific period of time. So when looking at the below data, we're looking at what prices are today compared to what they were 1 year ago today. So looking at fuel is currently up 58% from this time last year. Gasoline, 18%, electricity, 15%, transportation, 14%, right? We can all feel this pain in our monthly expenses, right? And this is the driving indicator of why interest rates continue to go up. But I'm gonna go over why I truly believe we are nearing a top and why I expect interest rates to start heading down roughly in about 30 days, and then realistically should continue to head down over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. So why do I believe inflation's coming down, right? First and foremost, you have to understand how to read the inflation data, right? Inflation, when you hear inflation year over year, all it's doing is it's adding up the month over month increases over a 12-month time frame, right? There are some compounding errors and there are some rounding errors, so it's not going to give you the exact number. But let's take a look at a graph real quick. Month over month, this is what inflation has increased each and every month, right? So these are when the inflation data comes out, right? But it's for the previous month. So on October 13th, 2021, this was the inflation data for September of 2021, right? So inflation in October of 2021 was 0.4%, right? And then in November, the November reading again was 0.9% and 0.8% and 0.5% accordingly, right? But now inflation on the year over year is going to start replacing some of these numbers, right? And realistically, what have we known? We know the Fed has increased interest rates over the course of the past few months, and they're going to continue to increase interest rates over the next coming months as well. By this happening, what is this doing? This is slowing demand, and this is increasing supply, which is all you want to slow down inflation. And we can see that in the past 3 months data. In the past 3 months, August, September, October, inflation has clearly slowed compared to this time last year, right? A 0% increase in August, a 0.1% increase in September, and a 0.4% increase in October of this year, this past month's reading, right? We can see that last October, it was 0.4%. And it replaced it with this October, 0.4%. That's not gonna do anything to the numbers, right? Inflation's still gonna be high. It's still gonna be 8.3%. I believe our top was around 9.1 and we've come down slightly. But what can we see? We can see that the numbers coming up are dramatically high and they will start being replaced with numbers significantly lower. And when that happens, that will give the Fed ammunition to stop the interest rate increases, right? So let's give an example. November's reading is 0.9%, right? We don't know what November, which is again October's actual data, we don't know what that number is going to come out with, but it's going to come out, in the first 2 weeks of November. But realistically, it's safe to assume it is going to be below 0.9%. We can see that because our past 3 months are sitting significantly lower, and the Fed has only increased interest rates even more, which should slow down inflation even more. So let's just say it's replaced by 0.3%, right? Well, if we replace 0.9% with 0.3%, that's gonna decrease our year-over-year rating by 0.6%. Remember, like I said, there are rounding errors and there are compounding errors, so it's not gonna be exactly the replacement. But if you replace 0.9 with 0.3, then our year-over-year inflation of 8.2% is going to be reduced to 7.5 to 7.7 range. Well, then that's a news for headlines, right? We've decreased year over year by 0.5, by 0.7%. That is what we need to see. And then realistically, we can expect the same thing to happen the following month, because in November it was 0.8%, which is also a high reading, which we will likely have a lower reading then. So then that 7.5 to 7.7% rating is going to drop to a 7 or a 7.3% rating. And then next thing you know, we can see the damage on inflation is going to start occurring. And how do we know these month over month readings are going to start decreasing? Well, we can clearly see that in just our, monthly information, right? We're starting to see deflationary cycles in building materials. US home prices fell for the first time since December of 2011, ending 126 monthly increases. Used vehicle prices, which all we know is when we heard during COVID and we heard during this inflation that cars started to become, a vehicle for investment. Cars have never really been a vehicle for investment. They've always been deflationary and they're always going to lose value as soon as you buy them. Well, that's starting to become true again. We see that used cars are officially down 0.1% from this time last year. So we can see all the information. And as a mortgage company, we can see this happening especially in mortgages. And that's what I'm going to go into next, because mortgages are very important to the CPI index. Mortgages, shelter, right, is 33% of the CPI index, 1/3. So it's the biggest single component of the CPI. Well, unfortunately for us, shelter is a lagging indicator for the CPI, right? And what this means, and we can see that in the data, right? A lot of this other information is starting to come down. We can see, energy is starting to come down. We can see, energy services starting to come down on a month-over-month basis, while shelter is still realistically increasing, right? We can see that. Shelter, 0.5, 0.6, now we're at 0.7, 0.7. Why? Because these readings are from July of last year, right? And we all know mortgage prices and rent increased dramatically during those time frames, right? So shelter, unfortunately, is a lagging indicator. So that we do know is that in November and in December, shelter is still going to remain high. And if shelter remains high, that is going to do some damage to the overall CPI, because again, shelter is 33% of the index, right? But using, projections, we can see that, real estate and rent inflation should be topping out around from the inflation perspective, right? They've already topped out, in real terms, right? We know mortgage prices are coming down. We know list prices are coming down, which we can, show you on data and show you on charts. But from an inflation perspective, when are they going to start coming down? Because when they start coming down, that's when inflation on the CPI is going to start coming down significantly more. And we can use that from data forecasts, right? So real estate and rent inflation should peak at around December, January of this upcoming year, right? So when that peaks, that's when inflation will start to come down even more, right? So then realistically, if you think at that point, our month-over-month inflations of 0.4%, we know those are going to come down even faster, especially if the single largest component starts to come down. And again, we can see that, right? Month-over-month changes in the rental index is currently down. We can see the median home prices for both listing and home prices are coming down month over month, and they're going to keep coming down month over month, especially during Q4, which is normally a seasonality period, but that is being accelerated by these higher interest rates, right? So as long as these come down, then this rental inflation forecast should hold true. So when those comes down, right, we can expect that these January, February, March, and then especially when you start looking at April and June and July of next year, when those 1.3% or 0.8% or 1.2% readings are replaced with 0.1% or 0.2% readings, well then inflation on a year-over-year index is gonna start coming down between that 4 to 5 level, which is what we need to see. And then when that happens, that's when the Fed will start to announce that interest rates or the federal funds rate will come down. That being said, remember, the federal funds rate doesn't directly correlate to mortgage interest rates, even though to me that's actually a little bit of a myth, especially in this market, right? It is true that, the federal funds rate does not correlate to the mortgage interest rate. That being said, in an economy which, is struggling and or interest rates are going up, and then you have news media outlets continuing saying that the federal funds rate is going up, well, that's going to add, pressure to increase, mortgage interest rates, and it's going to add, we have all the data coming out of the CPI, that CPI is still high. It's going to essentially be slightly correlated just by, a touch, but it's not actually directly correlated, right? When we start looking at the federal funds rate, to me, we have to look at this from 3 examples, right? The current federal funds rate is 3 to 3.25. That's our benchmark federal funds rate. It's already been pretty much announced that the federal funds rate is going to go up November 1st, November 2nd, right? It was previously 50 bips. That was the previous hike that it was supposed to be. Well, now it's going to be 75 bips. And then after the inflation data on October 13th came out, it's now projecting possibly even a 100 basis point increase. We'll go from 3 to 3.25 to 4 to 4.25. Well, then the Fed's scheduled to meet again in December. And when they meet again in December, they've already announced a 50 basis point hike as well. And again, they haven't announced this. This is what the futures market is projecting. And the futures market has projected all of the other ones, right? And then again, they're gonna meet in January and they're expected to do a 25 basis point hike, right? And the ballpark range of where the Fed wants to get is around 4.5 to 4.75. We're only at 3 and they want to get up to 4.75, so we still have a ways to go. But that is going to happen here in the next 90 to 120 days, right? The only thing that would stop that is if the CPI index started to come down, which again, we already know on that second week of November, the CPI index is going to come down. Theoretically should come down in December and theoretically should start to come down each and every single month on a year-over-year basis each and every month, right? So when that happens, that should maybe slow down the Fed. But to me, this is what I'm looking at in regards to where interest rates will be over the course of the next, 2 months, 3 months, all the way up to 18 months, right? Well, realistically, like I said, on that second week of November, the CPI index is going to come down. When that comes down, I believe, again, we have between now and the second week of November. I don't know what interest rates will do between now and then. The Fed, if the Fed announces instead of a 75 basis point, 100 basis point hike on November 1st, could that cause interest rates to go up? Yes, it's possible, right? But I don't know what's gonna happen the next 20 to 30 days. I'm using this analysis to help project what's gonna happen after that. So when that inflation comes down on that second week of November, to me, this is our top, somewhere in these next 30 days or currently today. And then when CPI comes down, well then realistically we'll have all the media headlines come out and then inflation will come down and then that's when interest rates will finally start to trend down. So November's reading and December's reading, they should start to come down. So again, I'm not quoting interest rates, this is just a ballpark. If interest rates are 7 today, maybe in November and December, they start to come down to 6, 6.5. Well then in January and February, March and April, when shelter starts to catch up on the index as well, right? So we already have the rest of the indexes coming down, and now shelter, the single largest component, start coming down as well, because again, we know home prices and we know rental prices are officially coming down. That's what cause even a lower year-over-year inflation data. That's when interest rates should start to head lower again, right? So maybe between Q1, we'll start to see again 7 to maybe 6 to 6.5. Maybe we'll then see 5 to 6. And then realistically, our ending point, because again, whether the US is in a recession or not, housing is in a recession. It is 100% in a recession right now, and rates are high, values are coming down, right? Well, when will the housing recession end? That's a difficult question to ask, but to me, that ends with the following data, right? Every time the Fed has had to seriously fight inflation, they've had to increase the federal funds rate above the prevailing core inflation rate. Core inflation rate is not the same as the inflation rate. So core inflation is inflation minus food and energy. And why does that matter? Because essentially the Fed can help with a lot of prices, right? And help slowing down, other items and other categories in the inflation index. The Fed cannot really do anything for food. What food costs is what it costs. Same thing with energy. The Fed can't really do anything with those items, so that is why core inflation is not included in those, right? So when core inflation starts coming down as well, or that's the measure of, again, what I'm looking at is the final, and when our housing recession will officially be over, right? Well, we need core inflation to be lower than the federal funds rate. Well, we know core inflation, which came out on October 13th, was around 6.6%. The federal funds rate is only 3 to 3.25. Well, we know the federal funds rate by January should be around 4.5 to 4.75, depending on what the Fed decides to do. So if it's at 4.5 to 4.75, well, we need core inflation to be below that. Well, unfortunately, core inflation is probably going to remain high the next 2 to 3 months. because core inflation is heavily driven by shelter. And as we discussed earlier, shelter, a lagging indicator, is still going to remain high for the rest of the year. There's nothing we can do about that. It's going off of previous data, not our current data. So when core inflation starts to come down, because shelter starts to come down in quarter 1, quarter 2, and quarter 3, we can see that that's when core inflation should start to come down. And that's when we can use, again, rent as an example. This is where our data forecasts, end up being. Well, rent inflation should be around 5% by the beginning of 2024. There's other information in core, right? So it's not just, shelter, it's other information. So realistically, at that point, hopefully core inflation will be below 4.75. And then at that point, I believe the housing recession will be over. There's several other things that matter in the housing recession. Inventory matters, how's our economy going to react to jobs over the course of the next year. So this is just a ballpark range, and this is to give everyone some good information. So this is just to use as an example, but this is what I believe, right? Again, let's go over it one more time. November's reading, year-over-year index is going to come down. That's why I believe interest rates are at a top, right? Then January, February, March, core inflation is going to start coming down because that's when shelter should start catching up. And then realistically, by the end of next year, that's when the federal funds rate will officially be higher than inflation or core inflation, and that's when the housing recession will officially end. Again, we've already seen interest rates above 5% for 6 consecutive months, so this isn't new anymore, right? I don't see interest rates coming back down into the 2s anytime soon, but is a healthy market between a 4 to a 5.5% range? Yes, I believe that's a much healthier range for us to range from. So that's what I believe, and that's why I believe interest rates should be coming down here in the near future.